Hi everyone, this is a Module 2 video talking about 3 lenses that we're going to be using to better understand behavior. So in Module 1, we spent some time, just a little bit of time, talking about why behaviors easily get misread. We looked at some of the reasons that we quickly reach for an explanation, like we as teachers or professionals reach for something like a word that labels like defiant or unmotivated, attention-seeking, and how we explored a little bit. Those behaviors might tell us more about ourselves, our own feelings or frustration about what's happening, rather than telling us what's actually happening to or inside or with the student. So this week, we're going to be going a little bit further. We're going to give better tools. We're going to explore different tools that maybe give us a better or different reading of those behaviors and hopefully maybe more accurate. So those tools this week are going to come in the form of 3 theoretical frameworks. So Skinner, Pavlov, and Bandura. Now before you maybe tune out at the word theory or theoretical, if you're not a person who loves psychology, I am. And if you're not, that's okay. But stay with me. Don't tune out, because this isn't full-blown psychology class where you're going to be quizzed on these facts, or we're not going to ask you to understand the years that these people lived and when things were published. It's not a history of psychology. It's really just 3 foundations that give us 3 different or distinct lenses, or in some ways overlapping frameworks, but they're still a lens. And if we think about lenses like sunglasses or actual lenses we look through, they help us maybe see something better or in a different way. When we put on sunglasses, we can still see things, but it's just less bright, so we can maybe see a little bit better through a bright and sunny day. So the same way, these theoretical lenses are a way for us to ask better questions about students that maybe help us better decide what we can do to support them. So let's take a look at the first lens. The first lens we're talking about is Skinner, and you might think of Skinner, if you have a history of psychology and understanding of this, as operant conditioning. So Skinner's core idea is pretty straightforward. It's the idea that behavior is shaped by what comes after it. Consequences, which you also might hear words when we're thinking about operant conditioning, like reinforcement or punishment. The idea that something increases or decreases the likelihood that a behavior will happen again. So if a behavior persists, something in that environment is maintaining the environment. That something might not always be obvious to us as we talk about, but it is there. There's something that's maintaining. If we're using this lens, there's something that's maintaining that behavior. So the question when we're using this lens with Skinner, the question it gives us is, what is this behavior getting for this student? What does the student receive when they engage in this behavior? So a quick example is a student is maybe calling out repeatedly or talking out of turn when you're teaching. And every time they do that, the teacher responds. They maybe the first time redirect, the second time they correct, the third time they say, please raise your hand when you want to speak. But here's the thing, we've all experienced this. That response is giving the student attention each time. And attention, even when it's corrective, is attention. And for some students, that can actually maintain the behavior. The consequence becomes that teaching something, whether we mean it to or not, is actually maybe reinforcing and therefore teaching the student that it is okay for them to engage in that behavior. So this is, in this case, why just ignore it is actually more complicated than it sounds when we're thinking about behaviors and the lenses we use to understand the purpose or function that behavior serves. Ignoring a behavior that has been reinforced absolutely can work for some students, but it also will usually get worse before it gets better. And we call that an extinction burst, and it's completely normal. It's knowing in advance about an extinction burst makes it a lot easier, especially as we're thinking about this course and developing ways that we're going to intervene with behaviors, is to say, if we think this is the lens we might use and therefore some of the structures we would build into supports for a student, we might want to expect, if we're going to change something that was previously getting reinforcement, in the example I was just talking about, talking out of turn or calling out answers without raising their hand and waiting to be called on. If a student's used to getting reinforcement or receiving some sort of attention by the teacher saying, I'll wait, or we raise our hand, they're going to likely experience an extinction burst if you change the chain of events that's occurring there. So it's important to keep that in mind with this framework. I will also just say, as we move into the second lens, Skinner's lens is usually most useful when the behavior is consistent, predictable, and it seems tied to some sort of clear payoff. So like when you're able to think to yourself, they do this every time this other thing happens, that might be more of a Skinner lens or a Skinner question. So let's take a look at the second lens. The second one is Pavlov, and what might be considered, if you think about Pavlov, you might think of classical conditioning. So the core idea of Pavlov's lens is about, if I kind of summarize it down, association. A neural stimulus would get paired repeatedly with something that already produces a response until eventually the response that's happening, so whatever that response stimulus is, produces the response on its own. So what that means, or what you might think of when you're thinking of classical conditioning, is you know the dog and the bell. That's what probably comes to mind, even if you are trying to recall from your brain, Pavlov, I think I know about that. You think of dogs and bells because that's what it kind of looks like in practice, or the most famous example of how this was found to be a thing is the idea that there was some sort of neutral stimulus and then it ended up being paired with something to cause an association. So students can be conditioned to respond to settings, transitions, people, routines, any number of things, not just what's happening right now, but to what their nervous system learns to expect. And I think that's an important one to think about when we're thinking about this lens. So the question then becomes, or that is given through this lens of Pavlov, is what has this student maybe learned to associate with this specific situation? So what that might look like is a student who is having a meltdown every time they're asked to transition to a new activity. Or it could be a student who shuts down when they get to a specific setting or classroom and refuses to engage with that setting or classroom, even before anything has happened. So nothing appears to have triggered them in this moment when we really do that initial analysis of saying, no one said anything, no one else is even in this classroom, and yet we had a full shutdown that happened. But their nervous system might be the thing that learned there's something coming. And that means it might be a conditioned response. It looks maybe like refusal. It looks in some students like defiance, but it can actually be a learned stress reaction. And I think that part is really interesting for us to think about, is that Pavlov's lens is useful when the behavior seems to happen in anticipation of something, when it maybe appears like it's happening before there's an obvious trigger to us, or when the intensity sometimes of the reaction seems disproportionate to what's actually happening in the moment. And I'm sure that last piece that I just said there is important for many of us. We can think of students where the reaction is disproportionate to what we perceived happened in an event, in a setting, and yet that's what the student did. That points to it could be Pavlov. It could be something that's been conditioned, and the student is associating something that they're experiencing and therefore anticipating that they're going to need to react this way. So let's hop over to the third lens here, which is Bandura and social learning. The core idea here with Bandura is that learning happens through observation and modeling. So we watch others, we see what happens to them, and we adjust our behavior accordingly and according to what we've seen maybe occur to others. But the piece of Bandura that's most immediately useful for the work that we're thinking about here is probably self-efficacy. So a student's belief in their own ability to succeed at a specific task in a specific context. So the question that gives us for these lenses then in Bandura is, what has the student learned to believe about themselves in this specific situation? So the quick case study, as we've done with the two before, we'll do with this one too. Let's say it's a student who refuses to start a writing assignment, kind of the one from Module 1 when we were talking about Marcus. They maybe have a history with writing. They likely do if they're in school. They've tried it before and it hasn't gone well for them and they don't enjoy it. They have learned, though, through these experiences across grade levels and teachers, that trying leads to failure. And it's pretty much a given in their mind that when they try, what the outcome is actually failure. And so not trying actually protects them and stops that cycle in their mind from happening. So they learn that they don't start. They start to do other things instead, like distract themselves or bother other students next to them. They ask to go to the bathroom. They find anything else to do other than engage with the task. And from the outside, that can look like laziness. It can look like defiance. It is actually, and it can be, if this is the lens we're using, maybe a self-protective response that's rooted in a belief about themselves and what they're capable of. And that belief is the thing that we actually need to change if we're using this lens. And you can't change it without a consequence. So Bandura's lens is useful when we're thinking that there's a behavior that's maybe tied to a specific task or a specific domain, when avoidance of challenge is a pattern where the student's history with this kind of task or work is maybe relevant, and we have to consider that we need to change something about their interaction with it, and that might be their underlying belief that allows them to think it's better for me to not try at all than it is to try even a little bit. So in terms of using this information, choosing your lens, here's what I want you to walk away with today. Most behaviors are actually going to likely, especially more complex behaviors, have these three frameworks in them. It's not going to be just so black and white that you say it's very clearly only this. And that's normal. The skill isn't necessarily that we're finding one right answer, because what we should start to deeply understand is we may never have the full picture. There are things that are happening internally inside of all of us at any given time that no one might be privy to, right? So we're not seeking the right answer. It's knowing which of these questions or lenses gets us closest to something that you can use, that you can plan with and around and make changes in what you're seeing in the student. So the quick practical test, ask yourself, Skinner, what's maintaining this behavior? Can you identify something that is clearly maintaining this behavior? Pavlov would be, what has been learned through association here? What is this student anticipating or associating with what I'm asking of them or what I'm seeing in this behavior? And Bandura, what does the student believe about themselves in this situation? And is that something I can help potentially change inside of them? Whichever question gives you what you feel is the most useful answer for the specific student or behavior or environment right now, that's the lens you would probably want to use to get started with kind of a theory or a hypothesis about what's going on. It doesn't have to be permanent. It's not permanent. It's just a way to start that's different than the potential labeling of, oh, they never follow directions. Well, maybe there's a reason they're not following the directions, and maybe these three lenses can help us understand or determine what that reason is. And it might shift as you learn more, but it's about a starting point. So this is a starting point for us this week as we dig in a little bit more. And that's really asking you to associate with your first milestone for the bigger project is choose a student or a person you're focusing in on, and then begin to try each of these lenses on and see if you see something different as maybe an aha moment that you didn't previously. It's not about which theory is correct. It's actually about what gives you something you can use to maybe inform an intervention or a support plan or something that you can address in what this behavior is that you maybe hadn't thought about before.